Sewing Refashions with MotherMake.com. Follow along with me as I turn Dad's medium dress shirt into the cutest 12-month-old ruffle dress. Subscribe to my channel Mother Make to see more of these refashions. Let's get started. Deconstruct the shirt by cutting around the armholes, neck hole, and back stitching of the shirt. Cut a straight line off the bottom of the shirt to create the bottom of the dress. Make sure to line up the pattern or grain of the shirt to cut a straight line. Line the sample dress on top of the fabric, leaving a few inches at the top and bottom for seam allowances. Cut the fabric along the waist using the sample dress as your guide. Open up the bottom of the dress along the buttons and align this large rectangle along the buttons and buttonholes of the shirt. Cut and sew the seam so it removes the strip for buttons. This will create a large loop. On professional seams, the seam is folded down and top stitched. I want my seam to look professional, so I mimic this look. I iron down the seam and top stitch next to the seam, which holds down the extra fabric and makes the seam look professional. Once this large loop is created, I'm going to gather it to make the bottom of the skirt. To get it ready to gather, use your iron to double fold the top and bottom of this large loop. Then top stitch the double fold down. Now you're going to make a perfect gather by using a basting stitch. Change the setting of your stitch to the longest stitch length. Right above your top stitch and below your top stitch, you are going to sew 2 rows of basting stitch. Use the top stitch as your guide for your basting stitch. Do not back stitch or cross over the beginning point of your basting stitch. Leave the beginning and end threads long so you can pull them later. To gather the skirt, you are going to pull both ends of the basting stitch thread. Take both threads on each side and tie a knot in the thread so the string pulls evenly. Carefully pull both threads on each side to gather the skirt. Do not force the threads and break the string because you will have to start all over. Now to make the bodice, place your gathered skirt to the side. Take the front and back of the men's shirt and place them on top of each other so the top of the shirt and the bottom meet at the neck. Cut out the neck hole, making sure to leave an inch above the button at the top for hemming later. Cut out a half oval for the shoulders. Make sure when cutting out your pattern to leave 2 inches of extra material for your seam allowance. You can make both sides of your bodice even by cutting one side and then folding it in half and using it as a pattern to cut the other side. Place the right sides of the fabric for the bodice together. Take time to align the print. Pin and sew the sides and shoulders of the bodice. Unbutton and open up the seams of the bodice. Iron down the seams and top stitch the seams. Take the bodice and top stitch along the bottom opening under the buttons of the bodice. Serge or fold and top stitch the bottom of the bodice. Use your fingers to spread out the gather evenly around the skirt. Make the opening of the skirt the same width as the bodice. You can tie a knot in the strings used to gather the skirt, and it will force the gather to stay exactly the width you need. Slide the bodice into the skirt so the top of the gather lays on top of the bodice. Use pins to secure the skirt evenly around the bodice. Sew the skirt onto the bodice using a top stitch. Use the original sleeve of the men's dress shirt to make the sleeve for your dress. You can see that the original sleeve has a bell-like curve to create the shape. We are going to mimic this curve for the dress sleeves. Place the dress to the side to make the sleeves. Cut the sleeves apart along seam lines. Iron out the sleeves and place them on top of each other, making sure to align the print of the material. Use a piece of printer paper to make a pattern for your sleeve. Fold the paper in half. Use a pencil and draw half of a bell shape. Use your fingers to line the top of the armhole along the top of the bell. Curve the material down along the bell to make sure the bell is long enough for your armhole. The bell should be an inch longer than your armhole for seam allowances. Cut out the paper pattern. Place it on top of your material and cut out 2 sleeves parallel with the fabric's pattern. Fold the sleeves in half, right sides facing, and sew along the inside seam of the sleeve. Iron out the seam and top stitch on top of the seam allowance for a more professional look. Cut the bottom of the sleeve so the sleeves are even. To make the ruffle for the sleeve, cut out 4 rectangles along the pattern lines of the fabric. Make sure to add an inch on the bottom and top of the rectangle for hemming and 5 to 10 inches on the width to create the gather. To make my ruffle big enough, I place 2 of the rectangles on top of each other, right sides facing, and sew the pieces together to make the rectangle longer. Then I measure the rectangle to be 5 inches longer than the sleeve. I sew the other end of the rectangle to make a loop in the fabric. Serge both sides of this loop or ring and then fold once, or double fold both sides and top stitch around the loop so both sides are finished. Once you have top stitched both sides, you are going to use the same technique to gather the ruffle as you did the skirt. Sew 2 basting stitches around the top of the ruffle. Make sure not to back stitch or overlap stitching. Then grab both ends of the top string of the basting stitch and carefully pull these strings to gather the ruffle. Line up the ruffle to the cuff and make sure the width of the cuff and ruffle are equal. Grab all 4 basting stitch strings and tie a knot on the strings at the same width of the cuff to hold the gather of the ruffle in place. Slide the right sides of the sleeve into the ruffle and evenly pin the ruffle on top of the sleeves. Top stitch and sew the ruffle onto the sleeve. Pin the decorative ribbon notions onto the sleeve and then top stitch the ribbon on, overlapping both ends. The sleeves are done, and before I attach the sleeve, I'm going to add ribbon around the gather of the skirt that is attached to the bodice. Start by pinning the ribbon onto the back and pinning all the way around. Top stitch the ribbon into place. Attach the sleeve by placing the sleeve next to the dress, right sides facing each other. Then place 1 pin attaching the seam of the sleeves to the seam of the dress. This will make sure your sleeve will attach properly. Then open up the dress through the neck hole and continue pinning the sleeve around the sleeve opening. Sew the sleeve onto the dress. Remember to try your best to iron down the seam you just sewed around the armhole. The last step is to serge, fold down, and top sew around the neck of the dress. If you don't have a serger, you can double fold and top stitch this hem. And I'm done. Now it's time to see this cute dress on the little model. For more tutorials, subscribe to my channel Mother Make or follow me on Instagram @MotherMake. You can also see more pictures on my website, mothermake.com.